In 1963, the fire beneath Centralia, Pennsylvania, could have been stopped for roughly $50,000. Nobody paid it. 2 decades later, Congress spent $42 million to relocate the entire town. Most residents took the government's money and left the fire raging. A few refused. That fire is still burning right now, and engineers believe it could continue for another 250 years. But the fire did not destroy Centralia. Something far slower did. Centralia began as a promise carved out of the Pennsylvania hills, a borough officially incorporated in 1866, riding the first wave of anthracite coal fever. The land was laced with tunnels before the town itself had streets. Locust Run and Coal Ridge mines drew the first Welsh, Irish, and Polish families, each bringing their own language, rituals, and saints. By the turn of the 20th century, Centralia's population hovered near 1,400. The census listed miners, their wives and widows, children in crowded schoolrooms, and grandparents who remembered the old country but would be buried here. Life in Centralia followed the rhythm of the mines. Before dawn, men descended into the shafts, returning blackened and exhausted to homes packed with 3 generations. The churches, 7 in all, stood at the heart of every block, their bells marking baptisms, weddings, and funerals. On Sundays, the Polish Catholic choir and the Welsh chapel hymns drifted over the rooftops. The Odd Fellows Cemetery kept silent watch at the edge of town, its iron gates opening for every family in time. After work, the town's 27 saloons came alive. The Bull's Head Tavern, the Centralia Hotel, and a dozen others were more than bars. They were where union meetings, strike votes, and wedding feasts happened. The Centralia Baseball Club played behind the schoolhouse, cheered on by mothers and miners alike. Property passed from hand to hand in quiet rituals, deeds signed over at kitchen tables, lots divided so each son might build a house of his own. Everything in Centralia was layered, kin over kin, memory over memory, the living over the mines. Before the fire, the town was not just a dot on the map, but a dense weave of routine, hope, and inherited struggle, ordinary, enduring, and for a century unremarkable. On a gray morning in May 1962, the Borough Council authorized a routine burn in the old strip mine pit behind the Odd Fellows Cemetery. This was not a reckless act by outsiders, but the continuation of a local habit. Trash fires had long been the accepted way to manage the growing dump on the edge of town. The pit, once gouged open for coal, now served as Centralia's landfill. On that day, workers set the garbage alight. Some say with gasoline-soaked rags, others recall only a match and a pile of refuse. The flames crackled and smoke drifted over the cemetery fence. When the fire appeared to die down, the crew left, assuming their job was done. But beneath the ashes, the ground was different. The strip mine exposed raw anthracite seams, hard, high-carbon coal that can burn for decades if given the smallest spark and a trickle of air. A fissure, later measured at 15 feet deep, cut through the pit's floor, connecting the surface to the labyrinth of abandoned tunnels below. Whether the fire slipped through this crack or found another hidden path remains uncertain. Borough records and eyewitness accounts disagree. Some insist it was a controlled burn gone wrong, others claim an accident or even a pre-existing blaze smoldering in the trash. The precise ignition point is still debated, but by the end of that summer, the fire had entered the CMs. What began as a mundane act of municipal housekeeping became the opening move in a disaster that would outlast the town itself. By the late summer of 1962, the trouble beneath Centralia was almost invisible. The fire, now hidden under layers of earth and memory, crept along old mine passages at its own pace. In the beginning, the signs were scattered and easy to dismiss. A backyard would slump overnight, leaving a shallow depression where children once played. A garden fence tilted, its posts sinking into ground that had grown strangely warm. Asphalt on Park Street buckled, forming a soft ridge that town workers patched without much thought. The air, especially after rain, began to taste faintly of sulfur. Some compared it to rotten eggs, others to an old match struck too many times. The odor drifted through open windows and seeped into basements, but most residents shrugged it off as another quirk of mining country. The mines had always left their mark: coal dust in the curtains, black water in the drains, the constant rattle of trucks at dawn. A bit of bad smell seemed ordinary. Occasionally, a wisp of smoke curled from a crack in the soil near the dump. On cold mornings, steam would rise from seams along the cemetery fence. In 1963, a small sinkhole opened behind a row of houses, swallowing a length of sidewalk and exposing the raw, hot earth below. Borough Council minutes mention it only briefly, noting that the area was roped off and filled with gravel. State inspectors took temperature readings, 190 degrees and then higher, but the numbers stayed in field notebooks, not in headlines. Carbon monoxide levels ticked up in a few cellars, but the warnings were buried in technical reports. Each symptom arrived alone, never quite enough to convince anyone that an emergency had begun. The fire, unhurried and mostly silent, threaded itself deeper into the town's foundations as the decade wore on, waiting for someone to notice what was already lost. In the years after the fire slipped underground, a quiet paper trail began to accumulate in government files. Inspectors from the Pennsylvania Department of Mines recorded carbon monoxide levels in a handful of cellars, sometimes high enough to warrant concern, and always filed away in technical language. These readings, taken sporadically between 1962 and 1964, rarely reached the public or even the town council. Instead, they remained in field notebooks, their warnings muffled by bureaucracy. By April 1963, the state's own engineers calculated that extinguishing the fire would cost around $50,000. The estimate, detailed in a report by E.L. Garrison, broke the problem into excavation, water injection, and monitoring, each line item carefully totaled. That figure, equivalent to less than $500,000 in today's dollars, was sent up the chain to Harrisburg and on to federal officials. Letters from borough leaders and state engineers described the situation as urgent, but the responses were slow, cautious, and non-committal. Each reply asked for further study or a revised plan. As months passed, the projected cost began to climb. New surveys warned that the fire was advancing along the seams, that more ground would need to be dug, more water pumped, more labor paid for. By 1965, the sum had ballooned to $250,000, 5 times the original estimate, with no real progress made. The correspondence grew thicker, but the work on the ground stalled. The record shows a disaster that unfolded not with a single decision, but through a steady drift of inaction, as the price of intervention rose and the will to act faded into paperwork. On a cold February day in 1981, 12-year-old Todd Domboski stepped into his grandmother's backyard. The ground, frozen and familiar, gave way beneath him without warning. In an instant, Todd was swallowed by a sinkhole, about 4 feet wide, plunging down an estimated 150 feet. The earth exhaled steam and the stench of sulfur. Todd clung to a root, his legs dangling over a drop that disappeared into darkness. His cousin, close by, heard the shouts and reached down just in time, pulling Todd out of the pit as hot, moist air billowed around them. Emergency crews arrived within minutes. The fire chief's gas meter registered carbon monoxide at 11 parts per million at the rim, well above safe exposure, enough to cause confusion, headaches, even death if inhaled for long. The mud at the bottom scalded the soles of Todd's shoes. Medical workers found his pulse racing, his skin marked by the heat and the shock. He was rushed to Ashland Hospital, where doctors measured elevated carboxyhemoglobin in his blood, a silent record of what he had breathed in those few seconds underground. The sinkhole's appearance was not a surprise to every resident. For years, the ground in Centralia had shifted and slumped, But until that moment, the danger had always been someone else's problem, hidden in cellars or measured in numbers on forgotten reports. Now, the hazard was undeniable, visible, immediate, and nearly fatal. Reporters from Philadelphia and New York crowded the street, their cameras aimed at the raw wound in the earth. State officials, confronted with the scale of the threat, could no longer defer or downplay what was happening beneath the town. The Domboski incident forced a reckoning. What had been a slow-motion disaster, managed by paperwork and delay, became a national crisis overnight. For Centralia, the line between private risk and public emergency had finally vanished. By the early 1980s, the scale of the fire beneath Centralia had become almost impossible to ignore or contain. What began as a flicker in a trash pit now stretched under roughly 400 acres, a labyrinth of burning anthracite, hidden from view but always present. Subsurface temperatures in the hottest zones soared above 800 degrees Fahrenheit. In some spots, the heat warped the ground, softening asphalt and killing the roots of trees before their leaves even browned. The fire's reach was mapped in fits and starts, always a step behind the reality underground. Old mine maps provided only a partial guide. Decades of hand-dug tunnels, some never recorded, meant that the true boundaries of the blaze shifted with every fresh collapse or vent. Engineers and geologists struggled to predict where the next hazard would surface. The mine network twisted in unpredictable directions, with horizontal drifts, vertical shafts, and collapsed stopes forming a tangled, unmappable web. No one could say with certainty which block would be safe tomorrow, or which backyard might open up next. The fire's presence was most obvious in the strange, random places it announced itself. Gases, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, methane, vented through cracks in lawns, seeped into basements, and sometimes drifted invisibly into bedrooms at night. Residents found patches of earth too hot to touch, even in winter. On cool mornings, steam and sulfurous vapor rose from seams in the soil, curling around fence posts and foundation stones. The town became a patchwork of invisible threats. A house untouched one day could be poisoned or undermined the next, and the official maps could only guess where danger truly lay. Attempts to model or contain the fire ran up against the same uncertainty. The underground was not a single, continuous blaze, but a series of shifting fronts, fed by air from forgotten shafts and cracks. Each effort to cut off its oxygen or douse the flames was met with new outbreaks elsewhere. The fire, patient and indifferent, simply found another way forward. For Centralia, the ground itself had become unreliable, a slow, relentless force, always moving, always burning, always just out of reach. In 1984, Congress authorized $42 million, a sum that dwarfed every previous attempt to control the fire or protect the town. The money arrived as a line item in the federal budget, earmarked for property acquisition, relocation, and the systematic dismantling of Centralia. The plan was methodical. Every household received an offer, every deed cataloged for transfer. Relocation agents moved door to door, explaining the terms and the urgency. Most families accepted, signing away the only homes they had ever known. By the end of the first phase, entire blocks stood empty. School buildings, churches, and bars were shuttered, then razed. The demolition crews worked with relentless efficiency, flattening houses and removing the remains to prevent squatters or trespassers from returning. Water lines and power grids were cut, leaving the landscape stripped of its lifelines. The state did not simply erase homes. It erased the arteries that once connected Centralia to the outside world. The most symbolic act came with the abandonment of Route 61. The highway, once the town's main street, warped and split as the fire tunneled beneath it. Engineers declared the road unsafe. Barricades went up, and eventually the asphalt was left to crack and collapse, a scar running through the empty fields. The policy was total: remove the infrastructure, erase the addresses, and let the fire burn beneath an uninhabited shell. In the official record, the buyout was a remedy, a final, irreversible decision to walk away from a place that could no longer be saved. A dozen names lingered on the census long after most addresses had vanished. These were the holdouts, the ones who watched their neighbors pack up, saw the bulldozers flatten houses, and still refused to leave. For them, the fire was either distant or overblown, a slow threat that had always stayed just out of sight. Some pointed to the patches of green lawn, the quiet streets that never cracked, the familiar kitchen where nothing ever burned. The official warnings, they said, were warnings for someone else. They remembered the years when state engineers came with clipboards and gas meters, when condemnation notices arrived in the mail, stamped with urgency. The government bought property after property, but the holdouts filed suit, arguing that the danger was exaggerated, that the buyout was less about safety than about clearing land for reasons never made public. The legal battle stretched for years, until a final settlement offered a compromise. Those who remained could stay for life, but their homes would revert to the state when they died. There would be no inheritance, only the promise that the last light in each house would go out with its final occupant. In interviews, a few spoke quietly of loyalty, of stubbornness, of a reluctance to let go of what was left. The silence of Centralia became their inheritance, a town emptied not by fire alone, but by the slow, official withdrawal of everything that made it home. After the last houses fell and the last families left, Centralia did not vanish so much as dissolve into rumor and overgrowth. What remains is a landscape that refuses to settle into silence. Overgrown lots choke the old street grid, weeds swallowing the outlines of porches and driveways. Cracked foundations surface after rain, the only sign that hundreds of lives once stacked up here, block by block. The cemetery endures at the edge of town, its iron gate rusted but still upright, ringed by wild grass and the drifting scent of sulfur. On cold mornings, steam seeps from the earth, thin columns rising from seams that thread beneath the empty fields. The old Route 61, warped and split by the fire, has become a canvas for graffiti, its colors bright against the gray of abandoned asphalt. Suspicion lingers over the fate of this cleared land. Some former residents whisper that anthracite interests, not just public safety, drove the buyout. The official record is incomplete. No full accounting details who controls every parcel or what plans, if any, were made for the coal still locked beneath the fire zone. State agencies maintain that the land was condemned for hazard mitigation, but requests for documentation often lead to redacted files or missing pages. The records that survive raise as many questions as they answer, and no investigation has ever traced the flow of every dollar or deed. Geologists now estimate that the fire could burn for another 250 years, fed by seams that run deep and far beyond the reach of any remaining map. Centralia's afterlife is not a closed case but a slow, uneasy drift, an American ghost town where the disaster is still unfolding and the final chapter remains unwritten. Centralia's fire still burns. It smolders beneath empty streets, a disaster not of nature, but of neglect. Bureaucratic delay turned a manageable emergency into a permanent scar. Some questions about the fire's origin and the real motives behind the exodus remain unanswered, and maybe always will. In the end, Centralia wasn't destroyed. It was left behind. Let the silence remind us what inaction costs. Share your thoughts below.